to the grotto forthwith. "I confess, however," he added, "that I have little expectation of being able to ascertain our true position until I have penetrated some distance into the country." There was nothing in Dick's representations but what commanded Mrs. Weldon's assent as reasonable. It was simply her own nervousness, she acknowledged, that made her hesitate, but it was only with extreme reluctance that she finally yielded to the proposition. "And what, Mr. Benedict, is your opinion of my proposal?" said Dick, turning to the entomologist. "I?" answered Cousin Benedict, looking somewhat bewildered. "Oh, I am agreeable to anything. I dare say I shall find some specimens. I think I will go and look at once." "Take my advice, and don't go far away," replied Dick. "All right, I shall take care of myself. And don't be bringing back a lot of mosquitoes," said old Tom mischievously. With his box under his arm, the naturalist left the grotto. Negoro followed almost immediately. He did not take the same direction as Benedict up the cliff, but for the second time bent his steps towards the river, and proceeded along its bank till he was out of sight. It was not long before Jack's exertions told upon him, and he fell into a sound sleep. Mrs. Weldon, having gently laid him on Nan's lap, wandered out and made her way to the water's edge. She was soon joined by Dick and the negroes, who wanted to see whether it was possible to get to the "Pilgrim," and secure any articles that might be serviceable for future use. The reef on which the schooner had stranded was now quite dry, and the carcass of the vessel, which had been partially covered at high water, was lying in the midst of debris of the most promiscuous character. The wide difference between high and low water mark caused Dick Sands no little surprise. He knew that the tides on the shores of the Pacific were very inconsiderable. In his own mind, however, he came to the conclusion that the phenomenon was to be explained by the unusually high wind that had been blowing on the coast. Not without emotion could Mrs. Weldon, or indeed any of them, behold the unfortunate ship upon which they had spent so many eventful days, lying dismasted on her side. But there was little time for sentiment. If they wished to visit the hull before it finally went to pieces, there must be no delay. Hoisting themselves by some loose rigging that was hanging from the deck, Dick and several of the negroes contrived to make their way into the interior of the hull. Dick left his men to gather together all they could in the way of food and drink from the store room, and himself went straight to the stern cabin, into which the water had not penetrated. Here he found 4 excellent Purdays Remington rifles and 100 cartridges. With these he determined to arm his party, in case they should be attacked by Indians. He also chose 6 of the strongest of the cutlasses that are used for slicing up dead whales, and did not forget the little toy gun which was Jack's special property. Unexpectedly he found a pocket compass, which he was only too glad to appropriate. What a boon it would have been had he discovered it earlier! The ship's charts in the fore cabin were too much injured by water to be of any further service. Nearly everything was either lost or spoiled, but the misfortune was not felt very acutely because there was ample provision for a few days, and it seemed useless to burden themselves with more than was necessary. Dick hardly needed Mrs. Weldon's advice to secure all the money that might be on board, but after the most diligent search he failed to discover more than $500. This was a subject of perplexity. Mrs. Weldon had had a considerably larger sum than this, and Captain Hall was known always to keep a good reserve in hand. There was but one way to solve the mystery. Some one had been beforehand to the wreck. It could not be of any of the negroes, and not one of them had for a moment left the grotto. Suspicion naturally fell upon Negoro, who had been out alone upon the shore. Morose and cold-blooded as the man was, Dick hardly knew why he should suspect him of the crime of theft. Nevertheless, he determined to cross-examine him, and if need be, to have him searched as soon as he came back. The day wore onwards to its close. The sun was approaching the vernal equinox, and sank almost perpendicularly on to the horizon. Twilight was very short, and the rapidity with which darkness came on confirmed Dick in his belief that they had got ashore at some spot lying between the Tropic of Capricorn and the equator. They all assembled in the grotto again for the purpose of getting some sleep. "Another rough night coming on," said Tom, pointing to the heavy clouds that hung over the horizon. "No doubt, Tom," answered Dick, "and I think we may congratulate ourselves on being safe out of our poor ship." As the night could not be otherwise than very dark, it was arranged that the negroes should take their turns in keeping guard at the entrance of the grotto. Dingo also would be upon the alert. Benedict had not yet returned. Hercules shouted his name with the full strength of his capacious lungs, and shortly afterwards the entomologist was seen making his way down the face of the cliff, at the imminent risk of breaking his neck. He was in a great rage. He had not found a single insect worth having. Scorpions, scolopendra, and other myriapoda were in the forest in abundance, but not one of these, of course, could be allowed a place in his collection. "Have I come 6,000 miles for this?" he cried. "Have I endured storm and shipwreck only to be cast where not a hexapod is to be seen? The country is detestable. I shall not stay in it another hour." Ever gentle to his eccentricities, Mrs. Weldon soothed him as she would a child. She told him that he had better take some rest now, and most likely he would have better luck to morrow. Cousin Benedict had hardly been pacified when Tom remarked that Negoro too had not returned. "Never mind," said Bat, "his room is as good as his company." "I cannot say that I altogether think so. The man is no favourite of mine, but I like him better under my own eye," said Mrs. Weldon. "Perhaps he has his own reasons for keeping away," said Dick, and taking Mrs. Weldon aside, he communicated to her his suspicions of the fellow's dishonesty. He found that she coincided with him in her view of Negoro's conduct, but she did not agree with him in his proposal to have him searched at once. If he returned, she should be convinced that he had deposited the money in some secret spot, and as there would be no proof of his guilt, it would be better to leave him, at least for a time, uninterrogated. Dick was convinced by her representations, and promised to act upon her advice. Before they resigned themselves to sleep, they had repeatedly summoned Negoro back, but he either could not or would not hear. Mrs. Weldon and Dick scarcely knew what to think, unless he had lost his way. It was unaccountable why he should be wandering about alone on a dark night in a strange country. Presently Dingo was heard barking furiously. He had left the opening of the grotto, and was evidently down at the water's edge. Imagining that Negoro must be coming, Dick sent 3 of the negroes in the direction of the river, to meet him, but when they reached the bank not a soul could be seen, and as Dingo was quiet again, they made their way back to the grotto. Excepting the man left on watch, they now all lay down, hoping to get some repose. Mrs. Weldon, however, could not sleep. The land for which she had sighed so ardently had been reached, but it had failed to give either the security or the comfort which she had anticipated. End of Part the First. Chapter 14. Recording by Alex C. Talander, Davis, California. www.alexctalander.com